everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turn it up. Oh, hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. And today we're talking some very different kind of fantasy.
Yeah, this is a potentially off the rails episode already. It's in the vein of some of our other zany episodes, like Who Would Win, I think.
Yeah, here at the FTF podcast studio here, we're always trying to come up with new and exciting formats to deliver to you, the listeners. And today is going to be an experiment. It's going to be a bit of a wild ride. We'll see how it goes.
I'm excited. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited. And if you're listening to this, then that means we found it at least, passable. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. That's how on the edge this episode is going to be. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be wild.
Well, it's, again, going back to our generator that we've been working on. Obviously, you know it as what have we been calling it?
The who would win
scenario.
Who would win fantasy scenario generator, TM.
I know. Yeah. Okay. So we use the same technology that we've been hard at work in the FTF laboratory to say, if we can generate scenarios and character matchups, then do we have the technology to be able to generate whole books?
That's exactly right. A lot of people are like, oh man, writing a book is so hard, so much work. But can we create sort of an algorithm, a generator that basically writes the book for us? I don't see why not.
Well, we fell far short of being able to create a generator that writes a whole book, but we have gotten to the point where we can generate ideas for fantasy books, and then Charles and I can apply some of our improv skills that we do or don't demonstrate during our Who Would Win episodes, and try to expand on what the generator spits out there as the idea, and see if we can come up with some fun sort of outlines, more verbal outlines for what stuff would happen in the story.
That's absolutely right. We've come up with a new generator, our fantasy book generator, and it's basically TM, of course, thank you. What we're going to do is create a book title and some characters, and we'll see if we can't piece a nice little fantasy book together.
Yeah, and
I mean, let's not delay.
This doesn't go too awry.
No,
let's not delay.
No, it's not delay. It's not going to go awry. It's going to be great. It's going to be really, really good. It's going to be awesome.
Nice.
Everyone's going to love it. So,
as Charles said into the mirror this morning,
I'm totally 100% confident in this idea. So. Yeah, what we're going to do is we have a book title generator, and what that's going to do is it's going to pick two random nouns, I guess, that are common in fantasy book titles, and we're going to try and stick to the blank of blank formula. So I'm going to go ahead
like a Game of Thrones or
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, that kind of shtick with it.
Yep. Exactly correct. So let's do this thing. Are you ready, Dylan, for what our book title's going to be?
I'm ready. Generate two of those nouns, Charles.
All right. So the first word on our first title generator is fantasy. And then the next one, and then the next,
come on.
And then the next one is the word raven. It doesn't really. As you can see, the generator is off to a great start. Can we make a book?
Fantasy of Raven? A Raven of fantasy? Why did we put fantasy in there?
I don't know, but it's in there. Do we try and make this work, or do we draw again? The fantasy of
The Raven fantasy?
the Ravens,
A Raven?
the Ravens fantasy. Like
The Raven's fantasy.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Do we?
Let's try it.
Let's try it. Okay, so the book title is The Raven's Fantasy. Guys, I mean, I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover or maybe its cover title, but I'm intrigued. You know what?
Are you?
What is The Raven's Fantasy? I think that's going to be the whole theme of this book.
All right. Well, Charles, we need to know who our main character is.
Yes.
A Raven's fantasy. Is it a Ravens or the Ravens?
Ooh, I'm open. Do you have a preference?
Let's go with the Raven's fantasy.
Okay, The Raven's Fantasy. All
Okay.
right. So what? So we're gonna pick like a character role. This could be anything from like prince, princess, wizard, warrior, that kind of thing. So who is our protagonist?
Our protagonist, Charles, beep boop beep, is a princess, in fact.
Ooh,
Yeah.
a princess. I called it. All right. So The Raven's Fantasy stars a princess, and let's go ahead and get an archetype for her. And I'm going to go ahead and pick a random archetype, a loyal sidekick.
Wait, she's the loyal. So the main character is a loyal sidekick and a princess.
Yes.
Well, I have to think that she's a loyal sidekick to the Raven.
It's possible, maybe the Raven is some sort of driving force of the story, and who knows what it's fantasizing about. And the princess is like, well, whatever it is, I'm in all the way, and I'm going to help you achieve this dream of yours.
So we'll see if that's where it goes. I guess we need an antagonist, Charles, our villain here.
All right.
I'll pick that. Beep, boop, beep. The antagonist is a dwarf.
All right. And, very appropriately, you never guess what I drew, a reluctant hero.
Interesting. So the antagonist is a reluctant hero.
And then the antagonist is a reluctant hero. This is getting kind of a bit convoluted. But some readers like it when things get complicated and like all over the place. We're experimenting with character roles here. Let's try and make this work. So we have
we'll try.
The princess is what it could be maybe is a story about a princess who's a loyal sidekick to a dwarf, but then the dwarf ends up being like a bad guy. And somehow there's Raven stuff involved.
Here's what I think, Charles. Yeah? I think the dwarf is the Raven, and the Raven gets some sort of idea of the way that the Raven wants to make the world or change the world, and that's the Raven's fantasy. So I think, what if the princess is, like you said, loyal sidekick to the Raven, this dwarf, and it's kind of like a twist that turns out that the dwarf is actually a villain. The dwarf kind of reluctantly comes to figure out all these things are wrong with the world on this adventure that the Raven is on with the princess, and then like the dwarf sees themselves as this reluctant hero, Charles, when he tries to make his fantasy a reality.
That's true. Maybe what we have here is there's the dwarf, right? He's our reluctant hero, right? So maybe we can twist it, right? So maybe his dream, right, or his fantasy or his vision or whatever, we're going to very loosely define fantasy there, is something that's not in line with what a hero does. Like he's on a mission, he's supposed to do something heroic, so he's reluctantly doing that when he wants to do something else that makes him the antagonist. And then the twist is that he eventually falls into that dark side, piece of it. And the princess, our antagonist, is the one who's like trying to stick by him, but as he's more and more...
You mean protagonist.
Yeah, our protagonist. I keep saying this confused.
Our loyal sidekick.
Yeah, our loyal sidekick, our protagonist, is trying to stick loyally to the dwarf's side, right? And then as the story progresses, the dwarf is falling more and more into the like antagonist role, and the princess, our main character, is like, how loyal am I to this to this character?
Right. So I think the princess's character arc is basically coming to realize that she no longer wants to be as loyal a sidekick or be a sidekick at all
Right.
with the dwarf,
Right.
the that everyone knows as the Raven, because the dwarf has gone astray trying to implement his vision for the world.
Right. And then, the role of a princess is that eventually one day they become a queen or something, right? So it's like this shift in responsibilities potentially also. Like, potentially, like, oh, like, I'm trying to transition from the loyal sidekick to the queen. That's an interesting progression, because princesses
Right.
are like this. There's this like seen not heard kind of thing that you could have about like a medieval style princess of like, oh, we just kind of marry them off to someone and negotiate, and they don't actually hold power. That kind of trope. But then it's like, and so she's expected to be this loyal sidekick, and then as she advances in the story, she becomes a leader or something like that.
Right. So we need to figure out, Charles, how did the princess become the Raven's loyal sidekick?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the background to that?
That's true, and we should also So we should decide if the princess is also a dwarf, right? Is this reluctant hero
That's a good
dwarf
point.
character? Is this reluctant hero like the queen, or an older sister, or an older brother, or something like that? Like next in line or something. Maybe it's the younger sister or something. I don't know. Like what roles would a princess be a loyal sidekick to? In what roles would a princess be a loyal sidekick? Maybe to
What if she,
if she's
Charles?
engaged, like,
It's tired. It's tired, Charles.
yeah.
We can do better. I think. What if she is like an exiled princess, or her
Uh-huh.
kingdom has collapsed in some
How
way, and she's
grimdark
kind
of
of
you.
trying to put the yeah, she's trying to put the pieces back together, and somehow she's taken in by this like dwarf, the rave, like who's in charge of some sort of like dwarf, either kingdom or land or whatever, right? Uh, and he kind of like inculcates her into the fold, Charles.
Mm.
Uh, what do you think of that?
I am digging that. Maybe we can come up with a situation, because the princess needs some skin in the game for whatever it is. Maybe the dwarf is promising like, oh, like I can help you get back into power or something, get you back on the throne, get revenge for your betrayal or whatever the case is. And then she's like,
Right.
yes, absolutely. And then this is like, he's showing her like a whole new world of like strength and power and fighting and loyalty and all this other stuff. But then the dwarf is like, in his mind, he's just shamelessly using her to do his own stuff, and he plans on betraying her or whatever. But he's slowly being like, she's all right, kind of a thing. Maybe, I don't know. Like, what makes it that antagonist role?
Well, I think there's two routes we can go for why. Like, the dwarf is either the antagonist the whole way, like is doing all of that kind of crap behind the scenes and then becomes the reluctant hero at the end, or the dwarf is a reluctant hero at the start, Charles, and then comes to the point where he's the Raven and he's going to institute his fantasy by actually having been a villain, like actually
Mm-hmm.
becoming a villain at
Mm-hmm.
the end. So I think either way, if we're balancing villain or antagonist and reluctant hero here, like it's more like that's the transformation rather than that's what he wasn't always both. So which do you prefer? Reluctant hero
Yeah,
to villain
I'm
or
wondering. It's
villain to
like, so
reluctant
is
hero?
the dwarf manipulating the princess from day one, or is the dwarf realizing that the princess is no longer like, the dwarf is realizing that the princess is becoming more and more of a opposing force.
Right.
This idea of like the reluctant hero, it's like, oh, I'm doing this, but I don't really want to be doing this. So it's like, what is?
Ooh, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
What if it's a corruption arc for the princess?
For the
And the
princess.
dwarf's the kind of the villain at first,
Oh,
and then as he's seeing all of the ways in which so like you said, Charles, princess grows up in this sort of patriarchy type society, and that's why she starts off more like submissive, and she is seeing like she's seeing people like the Raven, the dwarf character here, as like, oh, I should be their sidekick. I should be subservient to them because they know what's actually going on. But because everyone in her family has died and whatever left her exiled, well, she is actually the like heir to the throne, the rightful heir to the throne now, because there's
Mm-hmm.
no one else left, Charles.
Right.
So she was kind of realizing that over time, and she's actually, as someone sort of like rendered powerless in her role as a princess, like kind of near power but doesn't have it at the start. Now, as she's getting this opportunity to potentially be the queen and actually rule,
Right.
she's rallying against all these messed up things about her society that kept her subservient in her previous role.
Right, and the
And
more she's
she
loyal
goes
to the
too far, though.
dwarf and the more their story progresses, the more power they get, and the more taste for power the princess has, the less she becomes a loyal sidekick, and the more she becomes like this corruption arc, like tyrant
Ooh,
role, and then the dwarf
yeah,
becomes the reluctant hero when he's like, now
yes,
I have to do something about this, and I have to like take
exactly.
her on, kind of a
So
thing.
the dwarf, ooh, so she comes in, Charles, and the dwarf has this vision for how the dwarf is going to change the world, right? The Raven's fantasy, of course.
Hmm.
And then like he's got some dark ideas of all this kind of stuff, and she's kind of like, okay, yeah, this is a little messed up, but this is my only like safety, is being with the Raven and his crew here. And then like his dark ideas are actually embraced to too large an extent by the princess. Like the princess ends up over the course of the novel just going too far. That's that our corruption arc, and we have kind of like the Ravens grappling with like, oh my god, like she's gone so far on the end of my like ideals that she is going to make the world like really messed up. She's going to flip it on its head in a bad way.
Hmm.
And then he has to say, you know what? Enough is enough. And he like when he betrays her or like kills her in the end of the novel, Charles,
Yeah.
then
Oh.
that's like the Raven's vision the whole time was like her
Well,
like
here, like I'm
okay,
going
okay.
back to because here's some I yes to all of that, and here's the thing, right? The Raven's fantasy. If we're gonna keep this thing of the dwarf being the Raven, which is fine, maybe this idea of fantasy, right? It's like this idea he has in his head. Maybe the idea is like, oh, like the princess is still good. We can still work together. Like we can, coexist, and there's still good in her, and all this other stuff, right? That's his fantasy, right? The fantasy that they can
Mm,
both exist and be at peace and whatever. And but then he has to reluctantly act against it. So it's like this the we're getting close to a theme here of
right.
something like, letting go of loved ones or something like that, or cutting toxic people out of your life, even if they're family. Maybe it's
Interesting.
something like
I
that.
was I was thinking it was like Frankenstein's monster, right? There's like that quote. They say it's like, oh, what is it? The whole thing about like the real monster is Dr. Frankenstein, not actually Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what if it's just like something with the dwarf creating the monster that is the princess and then having to like stop it? Like that's kind of the
Oh,
theme
like
I was
maybe his
circling around.
fantasy was putting the princess on the throne and everything's going to be happy
Ooh,
dory and he'd be sitting pretty. And then it's like, oh, you know what? That's not working out. And I have to
right.
reluctantly do the right thing. And doing the right
Yes.
thing makes him the antagonist.
And makes him the person who, in the end, is actually implementing their vision, their fantasy.
Yes.
Uh, like, so, and what if, I know you're saying there, Charles, that the dwarf has these ideas from the start almost that, like, the princess is his way to control someone
Mm-hmm.
and implement his vision. So what if he was the one, unbeknownst to the princess, who caused her to end up in exile
This is
and who
twisty
like
turn.
killed all her family?
But because I'm open to it. But where I was like, where my brain was that the dwarf actually likes the princess, and that's the whole reluctant hero aspect of it, was like, I actually care about this individual,
Yeah.
which, how you work
You
that
could
then
do
into, I
both.
also killed your whole family and I manipulated you the whole time, um, could work, but
Well, he can start with a plan. Like, he doesn't know the princess. He just knows that there are these rulers and they can be like crappy people. I think like you can have her ruling family be pretty messed up rulers, like corrupt, all this kind of stuff, right? And
mm,
she's kind of this meek person at first because of the role she's been put in by being a princess in a society. And he like the Raven's this rebel, like topples the government in some way, but like doesn't know the princess yet, thinks that she could be used, and if he gets her on the throne and kind of has her ear, then he's going to now be able to rule and do it the way he wanted to, and he can come to like her over time. And that can be what's complicated. Like when he actually starts doing this, he's like, oh, she's actually pretty nice or whatever, or interesting or smart, or all these things she's going to have when she eventually like goes bad, breaks bad.
okay, yeah, this is an interesting dynamic here. um I'm on board with it. So we have The Raven's Fantasy by the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, starring a princess who is the loyal sidekick to a dwarf known as the Raven, who helps the princess who was recently exiled, find a new life, maybe some kind of warrior princess kind of thing, as she attempts to regain the throne. Throw in a little bit of a corruption arc, which is kind of trendy right now. I do think that's a great move. Corruption arcs are big, and as that corruption arc starts to materialize, the dwarf reluctantly takes on the antagonist role, but also the more perceived heroic role as well.
Yes.
And that's the story.
Yeah. And I mean, don't forget all the character growth of
Oh,
the princess
so
as
much
she
character
becomes.
growth.
She starts like pretty much oppressed in her role, and then she comes out of her shell and shows all these gifts that she has over time, Charles.
Right. Like
And
maybe she was like emotionally abused or something like that, so she's very quiet. She doesn't really have many opinions. She has no confidence, all these things. And then through the School of Hard Knocks and through her loyalty to the dwarf, she learns how to build that confidence and that authority and that self-worth and all that. But to what end? Now it's like
to too much of an extent here, that she goes all the way to the other side and goes too far with the Raven's vision or fantasy, if you will, for what the world should be like.
That's a little capital L literature right there.
Yeah, I mean, we've been circling around that. I mean, she's got to. I think that's the thing that pushes the Raven over the edge to have to betray or kill her at the end. Is like, yes, I had all these ideas of we're going to rebel against the way of things. We're going to #break the wheel, if you will, for the Game of Thrones fans out there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just too much. These ideals, if you implement them rigidly, and she starts becoming so rigid.
Right, and let's extrapolate here. Let's get to the ending. So I'm more interested in like, now that we've got the beginning of her character, right? Now she's corrupted, and now the dwarf is taking on the reluctant hero role. How does this come to a head? It's a corruption arc, and you kind of alluded to the dwarf killing the princess, which I'm still on board with. I'm just considering all our options here. Let's come to an ending.
Yeah.
Got to be some epic kind of battle, for sure.
Well, what is the thing that makes the dwarf realize that the princess has gone too far? I think that we need to know.
Yeah, and we kind of also need to know what the Raven's fantasy truly is.
I think it's like it's breaking the wheel, right? It's leveling the playing field. They're in this monarchy.
Yeah, maybe dwarves are like a second-class race or something like that.
Right.
Bring xenophobia into the mix. Always a hot button thing in fantasy.
I think that, yeah, having the dwarves be oppressed gives them justification for why they start doing things like murdering
And
royalty.
having royalty being oppressors would
Yeah,
put the dwarf more in a hero role, also,
right.
which is what the
So,
character arc that we're trying to do is of this reluctant hero
mhm.
slash
So
protagonist.
yeah. So they're rebels, they're revolutionaries, but you have to question their methods to some extent, Charles. These the Raven and his murder, Charles. That's what no, that's crows. Ugh, right? Like a group of crows is a murder.
Yeah,
A
but
group of ravens, what is that called?
I don't know. Aren't ravens and crows the same thing?
No, I don't think so. Maybe they are. What's a group of ravens?
Oh,
Are you googling this, Charles?
I'm
The
typing it in. What? Oh, it's called an unkindness.
Oh, the unkindness. That's like, ooh.
Collective nouns for
So
a
the
group of
raven.
ravens include unkindness, treachery, and conspiracy. In practice,
Ooh,
most people use the
Charles.
word flock.
Okay, but I think what if it's like the raven and his unkindness? That's the name of his revolutionary group,
Yeah.
and I think that yeah, his methods are
And if it
obviously
does perceived betray also in a conspiracy that all
yes
wraps around this theme of birds of ravens.
of birds. Yeah, so the raven and his unkindness have all these like messed up methods, right? We use the word Machiavellian a lot on our podcast to describe some of these characters, like Rin or whatever. I think that the methods are pretty Machiavellian. The ends justifies the means. They do some messed up things, but even the Raven has something of a like moral code. So when the
Here's something
princess, yeah,
interesting. Here's something interesting because if you take this Machiavellian end defines the means things and you could twist it a bit, maybe be like the dwarf was kind of like we've seen a lot of characters who are able to kind of offset responsibility by saying, oh, there was a demon in me, or oh, there's a god possessing me, forcing my hand. There is a kind of like moral justification for being like, oh, we're the unkindness, we're like this oppressed group, we have justification to do whatever we want. But then all of a sudden he's reluctantly taking on this hero role because now he's all of a sudden got responsibilities and he's starting to like some of these people. He's starting to like you can use this excuse of being like a mercenary roguelike person to justify doing all kinds of stuff like, oh, ends defines the means. But then you're like, maybe not though. Like there's a lot that's in between that I actually really care about and want to, protect or whatever, like put that on his head.
yeah. So he starts learning that. I think what makes him the reluctant hero, Charles, as we've been saying, is when he decides that he has to kill the princess because she's gone too far. And I think you can build toward that with the things that you're saying there, Charles,
Yeah.
where he's like, okay, oh, I'm learning that even my philosophy, as like justified in it as I feel, there are people I care about,
Yeah, or maybe the
and
ends
I
aren't
have to
always
protect them.
justified. Like,
Well, he learns
yeah.
that because the princess is so Machiavellian by the end of it that he's like, that's too much. Like you can't do X or Y or Z. We just have to know what was the thing that makes because I think like by the end she's the like real leader of the revolution, and she's like justified in doing that because she's a rightful heir of the heir to the throne.
Hmm.
So they like kind of can rally both sides, both like the royals kind of like see her validity as a ruler, but the common folks see all the things she's doing as a revolutionary. So she's like becoming so powerful, Charles.
Right.
But
And sometimes with politicians, you have to make a few concessions to get support, right? So what if part of that is like she becomes a little xenophobic or whatever, or supports people that are xenophobic, and she's like getting more into that role of like, well, we'll just oppress like those dwarves over there or something, like she starts to get into that, like, because I need these votes or whatever, or I need that army or whatever
right,
it is. It's like we can't win without the soldiers, and I can't get the soldiers without greasing the palms of a guy that hates dwarves. Like, I
Charles. Well,
don't.
but I don't know. Maybe the dwarves is too like. I don't know if the Raven would. It wouldn't be complicated if the Raven saw the princess like oppressing other dwarves, it's very straightforward of like, no, you can't do that. The whole thing was about helping dwarves. So what if she starts oppressing elves, Charles, who were traditionally obviously like rivals to these dwarves and stuff like that, but they are also oppressed in this society just as much as the dwarves are.
That's true.
So she's kind of like, let's pin this all on the elves, and somehow the raven is able to figure out, hey, I thought elves were bad at first, but I started to get to know elves or whatever. And when he sees her doing to elves what was originally done to dwarves, even though it serves the dwarves well, he's like, no, I can't let this happen to another people.
Yeah, and you could have these scenes where this third party, these elves, go straight to the Raven and be like, yo, dude, we need your help, and you have to help us, because if this deal goes through, we're screwed, and we need to take some kind of action. And he's like, I don't really want to do that, but I can't. My reluctant hero trope thing is making me want to do it. And then, that's how we get to where we're going.
Right.
Okay.
Uh,
But
so she does something to elves,
and he does something
has
that
to
draws the line in
reluctantly.
the sand and puts them at
Yeah.
odds. And then that opens us up to like a trilogy, at least, I'd say. Because this is just the Raven's fantasy. No, like you have 2 more books coming up, or at least a whole intellectual property.
Wow, Charles. I don't know what's happening in the rest of the books, especially if the.
Well, now they're fighting.
Ooh, Charles. What if at the start the Raven actually did want elves to be like subservient in the society? So part of the reluctant hero thing is like, oh my god, like I wanted elves to be the ones who kind of take the heat in this society. I want dwarves to be lifted up, and I want some vengeance or whatever on humans, which I assume the princess is a human. And it's like the princess actually creates that society by the end, right? Elves are oppressed. So the Raven fantasy has been implemented, but he, like, by the end of it, he thinks that all of that is wrong. So then that's when he reluctantly heroes his way to like killing the princess or whatever.
Well, maybe. I fear that if we want the dwarves to go against the elves and then switch that, I feel like we're switching too many things too much. Maybe what we can do is to at least have the dwarves, the ravens fantasy, right? Because aren't crows like kind of solitary? Also, isn't that like a thing about ravens? Like, there's usually just a couple or one, but like if we go down on this like roguelike thing where he's more isolationist and being like, I'm just trying to look out for my kind and myself, and I'm in a bad situation just by the nature of who I am, and I'm just trying to not be subservient to anybody, and I don't really care what's going on outside in in the
Okay.
political world. I'm just doing my own thing, and F you if you're trying to do something else. But then as he gets more involved with the princess and he's helping people out, he's taking on more of a hero role reluctantly, because he's been often, cause there's always this archetype of the like, I'm the loner type, I don't love anybody, I just look out for me and myself and no one else. And then they start to like, the cracks start to show and whatever. That could be something of a trope that we're going with
But he
here.
can't be a loner and a like leader of a
No.
revolution.
But
at the
maybe
same
he's
time.
just like, I'm really only looking out for me and mine, and like
Oh,
he's not
okay.
involved politically. And then as he gets involved politically and realize it's more complicated than just taking care of yourself, it's like now you have to get involved in all this stuff. And the more you get involved, like the more you shoulder responsibility, the more you have to start drawing lines in the
But
sand.
what's his fantasy then?
His
I think
fantasy is
in
a
the
better
revolution.
a better world for himself and his crew, and then also maybe that he can live peacefully with the princess or whatever, or maybe even that they can both be on the same side or something. Would be this fantasy. I just don't want him to be like twisting his allegiances to everyone all the time throughout the whole book. I want to reserve the amount of twists to like the amount of mind changing going on to.
I think all we need, Charles, is he wants a world to be better for dwarves. I think that, and everything else is secondary. And I think if that's where he stands for the vast majority of the book, and his fantasy is like a world where dwarves are at least no longer oppressed, then I think I like the revolutionary aspects of it. I think we kind of need that foundation for the princess to actually like have fighters and people on her side, where this can go to a war or an uprising. So I think all we need is the vast majority of the book. The Raven only cares about dwarves, and then somehow gets to the point where it's like, oh no, I can't watch this happen to another
and
people.
Maybe the princess can be like,
hero.
look, to have a world where every type, every race is equal is like a fantasy. Someone has to be at the bottom. Could be like her kind of idea that she becomes. It's like someone's got to be at the bottom, and this is what it's gonna take. Yes, to be at the top. Someone's got to be below you, and then he's like, I disagree. So, which is an interesting thought about like how power works, and like what's worth fighting for, what's impossible to avoid, and stuff like that. Could be the whole.
She sees it as a zero-sum game, and he is more idealistic.
Yeah, she's like, you can't have the rich without the poor, and then he's like, why can't everyone just do their own thing? And that's how it goes.
Right. Yeah, he's trying to create a society that levels the playing field completely. She's like more, I don't know if pragmatic's the right word, but like ruthless and kind of like, this is the...
I'm taking what I can get as much as I can get kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think he thinks all ships can rise with the tide, but she thinks by the end of that it's naive. In fact, it's just a fantasy.
Yes, it's true. And we could subvert the dwarf thing by having them be like seafaring dwarves. Because like, I don't know, maybe there's like gold in the mines, and so they're like, okay, dwarves, get out of the mountains because we want them now because there's gold in there. Ooh. And so they have to be like nomadic. And they're like, you think we like being in these freaking ships? We hate the water. The water sucks. But it's like, this is what we were resorted to because all the land was taken. Potentially. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Ships is tough, but I like the idea of they're no longer in the mines or
in the mountains
like that.
Or whatever. You're stereotypical,
yeah. They've been forced to leave, and that's part of what they're disgruntled about, or them just being nomads. And if you want them to be pirate dwarves, Charles, I'm
not saying pirates, but I'm just saying like there's no land that welcomes them.
I like that,
but. Yeah, at least not in the mountains.
Uprooted.
I don't care if they're in the water or not, but it's not in the mountains. It seems interesting because you don't want to go into so many of the tropes. This is modern fantasy, people. We're not just gonna put dwarves in mountains and talk about gold and all that stuff.
Well, I think you have a fun way of playing with that trope, Charles, by having part of their story of why they want to revolt is that they've been forced to leave their original home.
Right, and as fantasy readers, we'd be more likely to see him as a hero, too, because we know, like, dwarves are supposed to be in the mountains. That's, like, the whole thing. So, it plays on that kind of expectation, too, which was good.
I like that, Charles.
That's it. The Raven's fantasy. And and it may be considered a fantasy to try and just peacefully, without conflict, getting what you deserve
without oppressing anyone else.
Yeah, you can't.
That's the fantasy.
The fantasy
Charles.
is like you can't just get equality without having to fight for it, kind of a thing.
I think it's like. I think the princess's attitude by the end is telling the Raven that his thing is just a fantasy. Like his idea of actually leveling the playing field for everyone is just a fantasy. It's naive.
Or it's naive to think he can do it without oppressing others or something.
Yeah,
that's her take.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I think that's the way this has to go, Charles.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
So it's like there's an epic like titular line that the princess says to the dwarf, where it's like, your idea of doing this way, blah blah blah, is like, it's just a fantasy, and I'm done with the Raven's fantasy. Boom.
boom, boom, and then it's like end of book one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's not real. Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
I think we did it, Charles.
I'd read that.
I mean,
Maybe.
if it was well written, I think that's kind of the thing, right? Like, ideas are kind of a dime a dozen, as I think we're kind of showing here. Like, that could be written really poorly or really well. I think there's a funny story about Jim Butcher where he's on an online forum, and he was like, look, it's all about writing. That's Jim Butcher, author of the Dresden Files and the Codex Alera. And he was on an online forum, and someone said to him, like, how important ideas are and blah, blah. And he was like, no, ideas don't matter. It's about actually like writing them and executing them. And then he was like, I could write any idea you give me. And basically it was like, come up with one, a la fantasy book generator almost. And someone told him, like, it's like Pokemon meets the Roman Empire, like Roman legions. And then he wrote the Codex Alera. And he was like, yeah, see, that's a ridiculous idea, but I, as a good writer, can write something good out of it. So I think all that's to say that this idea, it's all about someone actually, if they execute it well, probably could be good. If they didn't, it'd probably be
What I'm
awful.
hearing is we need to get Jim Butcher attached if we're going to get the Ravens fantasy off the ground.
I'll get right on that on social media, Charles.
Awesome.
Yeah. So should we like summarize where we landed on this? Because we said a bunch of different ideas. I mean,
sure. I guess we can kind of popcorn it back and forth here, a la high school. The Ravens Fantasy by the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcasts stars a princess who, through unfortunate events, winds up exiled, destitute in some way.
mm-hmm.
And that's how she somehow, by chance, meets the Raven.
Or maybe not so much by chance, Charles. Maybe by design.
Maybe by design. She meets the Raven, which is a leader of nomadic dwarves who are trying to
exiles themselves, Charles.
Exiles themselves, right. And the princess is kind of enamored by his leadership, and she identifies with their struggle, and she becomes the loyal sidekick. The dwarf obviously sees potential in having a princess in the game, and they work together to get equality for the dwarves and put the princess back on the throne. That's kind of the arrangement.
Right. Thank you for saying the stage. That's kind of Act 1, Charles. So as the princess follows the dwarf, the Raven, as he's known, they start to try to actually implement the Raven's ideals for what the world should be like. The Raven wants to level the playing field and bring it to the point where there's equality for all folks, really mostly thinking about dwarves who have been exiled from their mountain homes and oppressed in this society. And over time, the princess is learning and gathering how to be a leader, because it's a patriarchal society that she grew up in, where she was kind of oppressed herself in her role as a princess. But now she's the rightful heir to the throne, and she's learning all of these things about what it means to be a leader from this sort of revolutionary figure, the leader of the nomadic dwarves, the Raven. And she is kind of starting to see that the Raven might be a little too idealistic, that he might be a little bit too naive to actually create this world, and she doesn't know if it's actually possible to create a world where everyone's equal. And she's starting to think, Charles, maybe there needs to be someone else who gets oppressed to bring the dwarves up.
Meanwhile, you have the Raven, who up until now has been very successful gaining independence for his tribe by living in this nomadic lifestyle. They have the strength and the means to live independently, and he's realizing now that to be equal in this political spectrum, they have to get involved with all kinds of other groups, and the princess has been a huge catalyst in all of that.
Opens a lot of doors.
Right. And so what he's starting to realize is like, man, as I'm exposing myself more and more to politics and all this stuff through the princess, I'm entering this realm of like having to make tough choices that have consequences that I would have never had to face living the nomadic lifestyle. And that's when you have this conflict of ideals.
Right. So it's pretty tough for this, I guess, somewhat good-natured at heart, dwarf the Raven, to try to make some of these more ruthless or Machiavellian choices that one might have to make to actually successfully complete a revolution.
Right.
And we don't know if he really has the stomach for it. He's kind of idealistic. And the princess, though, maybe she does have the stomach for it, Charles.
That's right. The princess is starting to see, like, what we need to do right now is, something like, march on the elves or something, or get buddy-buddy with this unsavory character or whatever. Something that the dwarf would have never normally considered, and be like, you have to take these kind of risks. You have to, make some enemies if you're going to get to the top. And that's what I want. I want to get back to the top. And then the dwarf's like, I'm not so sure what I want anymore, if this is right or anything like that. And that's when the line is drawn.
Yeah. So the princess basically tells him that his way of thinking about the world is just a fantasy, that if there's going to be someone at the top, there have to be people at the bottom, and she's going to do some sort of nefarious thing, make some nefarious deal that will oppress the elves in order to both like get her back on the throne or something like that, as well as like bring up the dwarves and get the dwarves back to maybe their mountain home, something like that. And we need him to be a reluctant hero at the end, Charles. So I don't know if we need a trilogy, honestly. I think maybe like
don't say that. You gotta think of the sales.
Yeah, I know. Either way, he does something heroic at the end, and I think maybe that's just like separating himself from the princess and trying to do what's right. But I
mean, they can fight battles, they can go to war, they can spill blood, but they can both be alive at the end. They can come to a head 2 books down the line.
I don't know, Charles. I think you tell the story that there is to tell. We'll see. Maybe we leave it open-ended, depending on sales. If there's demand for second book, Charles, it turns out the princess isn't really dead. No, it's super cheap if you do stuff like that. He does something heroic at the end. He maybe like mounts he sends his troops in against the princess in some way and is able to stop her from oppressing the elves. He could defend
the mountains from her, protecting the people that currently occupy it, maybe,
Who are the elves, maybe?
Could be.
Sure. Right. He defends, I think he defends the elves and is able to keep them from getting oppressed for now, but she's still alive.
But by doing that, he's basically declared war on her, or caused her to declare war on him, that kind of a
Exactly.
thing.
Right.
And that's how it ends.
And then
war is declared. It's very ominous, and the book ends.
Exactly. And book 2, I think the whole trilogy ends with him killing her, though.
That's fine. When it ends, when we're ready for that. But you gotta fill a few books first. Jeez.
Sure. Ready for book 2.
Video games, Netflix series, the whole gambit.
The whole thing. All right, I think we told a story here, Charles.
We told a story.
I think we generated a fantasy book.
Honestly, it was more coherent than I thought it was going to be going into it.
Anyway.
Yeah.
If you told me that we'd have what we just said at the end of like kind of summarizing it, I would be surprised we came up with something that.
Yeah, this is a proper treatment. We send this to Jim Butcher's office, and he'll crank something out. And
I'm sure he's dying for our ideas.
And yeah, we'll be set.
Wow.
All
right, Charles.
Yeah.
We gotta Someone write this.
Yes, if you want to write it or do some art or something, go for it, and we'll reach out to you about the royalties. Yeah, we'll talk royalties.
We've been talking royalties all day, talking about this princess, Charles.
Heyo.
All right. Well, with that pun, I think
it's
the outro
yeah,
music,
yeah. We need to get you out of here, buddy.
Yeah, before I embarrass myself.
Oh.
All right. Shall I? The best place to reach us if you did enjoy this episode and you want to talk more about the Ravens fantasy or come up with your own ideas or whatever, I would say it's at the FTF Podcast 1 at Twitter. You can also find us on Instagram or Facebook at the FTF Podcast. You can go to theftfpodcast.com to find all sorts of things like our reading schedule and stuff like that. You can see my mouse on progress bar, which hasn't been moving as quickly as some might like. And yeah, Charles, if they are, they can also send us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com.
That's right.
But Charles, if they're really enjoying this and they're
if
on
you
Apple
like what you
Podcasts,
heard and you're on Apple Podcasts, you want to show us some love, toss 5 stars to our podcast, guys, right there on Apple Podcasts. I think we have like 7 5-star reviews, and you could be number 8. It makes a huge difference. If you like this format for a show, let us know. Honestly, I'm not sure how this is going to do. You never know. But it was fun to record. I feel better about it than I did going in, which is always a good sign. So make sure you
Charles,
let us
you
know.
said you're so confident at the start.
Oh, yeah, man. I'm always confident, man. We always. As long as I'm talking fantasy with my friend, that's all that needs to happen. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.